This is the first episode of Vaccines for the Mind, English language section. Today we have with us Mark Solms, a neuroscientist, professor of neuropsychology, psychoanalyst, co-chair of the International Psychoanalytical Association, author of many papers and books on these subjects, and someone who regards Freud as a pioneering neuroscientist. Hello, Mark Solms, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
As you know, the name of this YouTube channel is Vaccines for the Mind, or Mind Vaccines. How do we interpret this expression, Vaccines for the Mind?
Well, I find it an intriguing expression. I take it to mean that there are things that they are bacteria and viruses of the mind, which many of us infected by, especially these days, with increasing proliferation of information on all sorts of platforms. But also, I think that there are ideas that grab hold of whole disciplines, where we all get stuck in a particular view or a particular dogma, a particular frame of thought, and we need vaccines against that sort of thing. We need to be inoculated against those sorts of infections.
That's the idea. That's the point. That's the idea. Yes.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a splendid idea.
Okay, great. So the next question is, it's obvious. Was Freud for you a vaccine for the mind? If not, what did he represent for you?
Well, only when I became aware of the title that you are using did I think of him that way. I think it's a very apt way of describing the influence that Freud had on me. I was initially trained in the neurosciences, and in particular that branch of the neurosciences that they call neuropsychology or behavioral neurology. And that's the reason I was interested in that field, was because of the mental functions of the brain. That's what makes the brain interesting. And yet when I trained, which was in the early 1980s, there was just about no mind there. What we learnt about was so mechanistic and so sort of third-person descriptions of functions, rather than anything to do with the mind as we live it, the mind as we experience it. Mm-hmm. I read in 1984, there was a book written by Oliver Sacks. The book was called A Leg to Stand On. And in that book, he said, neuropsychology is admirable, but it ignores the psyche. That just captured my frustration completely. Yeah. So I then looked to psychoanalysis, and Freud in particular, as an antidote or a vaccine. In other words, what could I do to correct this bias, to free myself of these shackles of cognitivism and information processing, and inject into it something of the subjective dimension of the brain. And so Freud stood out for me as the neuroscientist who recognized 100 years before that moment in my own career, recognized that we need to take seriously the subjectivity of the mind, the being of the mind, and that the lived life of being a mind is just part of nature. We need to somehow incorporate this into science. That's how psychoanalysis was born. So, to the horror of my professors and my colleagues, I decided that I would train in psychoanalysis so that I could bring the psyche back into neuropsychology.
Okay, I know that you are working with dreams, but okay, the next question would be, which of Freud's works do you consider as the most relevant for our times, or for you? What do you think?
Well, it's funny that you should mention dreams, because I was doing research. I'm talking again about the 1980s. Mm-hmm. I was doing research on the one aspect of consciousness that was considered a respectable topic in neuroscience, and that was sleep versus wakefulness. This was the only aspect of consciousness that we studied those days. What are the brain mechanisms whereby we wake up in the morning and we go to sleep at night? And so I was doing sleep research. And the most intriguing thing, of course, about sleep consciousness is that the unconsciousness of sleep is punctuated periodically by dreams. This is a remarkable fact that while we're asleep, we have conscious experiences in the form of dreams. So I was looking at the brain mechanisms of that, not of REM sleep itself. REM sleep is just the arousal state. I was interested in the actual experience of dreams. What happens to dreams when different parts of the brain are damaged? It surely must, if different parts of the brain are damaged, it must have differential effects on the experience of dreams, just as it does on the experience of our waking cognition. So I was studying that. And at that stage, it so happened that there was a professor of comparative literature, not a scientist, who was teaching an open seminar at my university on Freud's great book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And so I attended that seminar in order to learn. That was my first exposure to Freud, in order to learn something about the subjective content of dreams, which psychoanalysis had famously foregrounded. In that seminar, the professor concerned, his name was Jean-Pierre Delaporte. He taught us, the people in the seminar, that you can't understand chapter 7 of The Interpretation of Dreams unless you first read Freud's Project for a Scientific Psychology. And so for that reason, I read that project. And in that monograph was everything that was missing in my own training in neuropsychology. It was just absolutely fascinating. I was mesmerized by that. And I didn't know that Freud was a neuroscientist. I had been taught, like we all are, that Freud was at best a pseudoscientist, and not proper scientist at all. But when you, via the for a scientific psychology, I then started to read Freud's neuroscientific works. And in particular, I read a book he published on aphasia, on disorders, neurological disorders.
1891.
Yes, yes. So those were my three jabs, my three vaccines, was the Interpretation of Dreams, the Project for a Scientific Psychology, and the aphasia book.
That's why you are now doing your research. You are returning to the project of Freud, and now you are doing a research up to date. if you can.
I would say really from that moment, which was about 1985, from that moment in my education and subsequent career, everything that I've done has been an attempt to complete the project, to bring it up to date. Because what the project was, let us not forget, it was Freud's attempt to translate what he had learned clinically about the mind, to translate it into neuroanatomical and neurophysiological terms.
And he didn't publish because he was not satisfied with the project. But now you are trying to fulfill.
Yes. I think that although the project was a masterpiece, it was a brilliant intellectual tour de force. It suffered from being overly speculative, in the sense that Freud recognized in the process of trying to write the project, he recognized that they just didn't have the knowledge that was required to be able to identify the neurological mechanisms of these complex psychodynamic phenomena that he had discovered clinically. So he said in a letter to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, he said that my method is imaginings, transpositions, and guesses. So no scientist is happy with a method that involves imaginings, transpositions, and guesses. But the point is, by the mid-1980s, which is when I started grappling with that project, our field had moved on enormously. And we had now developed methods. And since the 1980s, a plethora of more methods whereby we can indeed identify the neurological correlates of the most complex of mental functions.
And this is my next question, because based on your research in neurology, would you say that today's research corroborates Freud's findings?
You know, I want to remind you that, I mean, the short answer is yes and no. Okay. But I want to remind you that Freud's ambition or hope was not that his speculations about the mechanisms, the deepest mechanisms of the mind would all be proven correct. He was hoping that we would gradually improve on what he gave us, which was a starting point. Yeah. Freud was to psychoanalysis what Darwin was to molecular biology, and what Newton was to quantum physics. You know, it's a starting point.
Yes, but if you don't mind, I play chess, and I think that Freud is opening. Now
opening moves, yeah.
Yes. Now we need to do the next moves. Now we are in the middle game, so now it's our time to play this game. But using this opening, this is my analogy.
That's a fantastic analogy. That's exactly how I see it. And I want to tell you that in my research into the brain mechanisms of dreaming, which I carried on with for a good many years, I published a book called The Neuropsychology of Dreams in 1997. I published a paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in the year 2000, where I showed that dreaming and REM sleep are not the same thing. The brain mechanisms that generate REM sleep are different from the brain mechanisms that generate dreams. And in that research, it really was quite remarkable how much of Freud's basic ideas about dreaming are corroborated by our understanding of the brain mechanisms involved. Dreams are driven by motivational forces that are very similar to what Freud called the libidinal drive. We call it nowadays the brain reward system, or the seeking system. Some of us call it the wanting system. It's an all-purpose desire system. Desire. It is activated powerfully during dreaming sleep. It's actually quite remarkable to see that this system, which motivates us to do just about all of the pleasure-seeking object relating that we do in waking life, that this is switched on full blast during sleep. It's amazing.
But I have a question relating to this. What about Freud's idea of wish fulfillment?
Yes,
well, relating to today's neurological research?
Yes, if you just think about the three terms that I used for this brain system that drives dreams. Edmund Rolls, a very conservative neuroscientist, calls it the brain reward system. Panksepp, the leading figure in affective neuroscience, he calls it a seeking system. And Kent Berridge calls it a wanting system. Seeking, wanting, reward. This is the mechanism that drives dreaming. Yeah. So it has everything to do with wishes. If there's one part of the brain which drives our wishes, it is that system. It's driven by dopamine. If you increase dopamine in the brain, if you increase it a little bit, you start to feel optimistic and confident. If you increase it more, you start to become a little too optimistic. You start to become manic, and you start gambling, and you start believing all sorts of unrealistic things. And if you push it even further, you become megalomaniacal. You know, so it is very much a wish system. Absolutely.
It's absolutely fantastic. Okay, I just have one more question for you, because I'm really fascinated about what you are saying. But can you tell about other figures that were instrumental in the development of your research?
Yes. So first was Freud. as a result of my research into brain mechanisms of dreaming, I found that there are two parts of the brain which, when they are damaged, you can't dream at all. It stops completely. One of them is here. It's in the sort of perceptual cortex, particularly visuospatial perception. And it's not surprising that if you can't generate mental space, mental imagery, then of course you can't generate dreams, because that's what dreams are. They are made of mental imagery. There's a regression onto those perceptual systems, as Freud surmised. We see that in the brain. But the other area is the system I was just telling you about, that drive, that seeking, wanting, reward system. Now, it projects to the frontal cortex over here, but it has its origins in the brain stem, in a part of the brain stem called the ventral tegmental area. It's part of the reticular activating system. I was taught at university that the reticular activating system is just like the power supply of consciousness. It just turns up the volume. You know, it's like think of a television set. It has to be plugged in to the wall, otherwise it can't produce television. But it doesn't mean that television comes from the electricity supply. That's what I was taught, that the reticular activating system is like the power supply of the cortex. But when I discovered that dreaming is generated by one of the nuclei in that reticular activating system, and that's the one that's involved in this positive motivation, wishing, wanting, seeking, reward system, that led me to Jaak Panksepp. The work of Jaak Panksepp, who I mentioned briefly a minute ago, the great pioneer of affective neuroscience as opposed to cognitive neuroscience. He studied brain mechanisms of feeling rather than brain mechanisms of thinking. So he didn't study the cortex, he studied the brain stem. And since I had discovered that one of these brainstem systems that generates affect, generates dreams, I became interested in those systems altogether. And so via Jaak Panksepp, I came to shift my emphasis. When I said to you at the beginning that there's certain viruses that grab hold of a whole field that we need to be vaccinated against, one of those viruses is the idea that the cortex is where all mental life happens. If it's mental, then it's cortical. And also the emphasis on cognition. You know, in cognitive neuroscience, there's a terrible neglect of affect, of feelings, and of the subcortical structures, the ancient foundations of the brain. So Jaak Panksepp vaccinated me against the cortex and vaccinated me against cognition, and made me focus my attention on affect, on feeling, on the basic drives that motivate everything that we do, and which link us human beings to other animals. You know, one of Freud's great starting points was that we human beings are just another species of animal, that we're embodied creatures, that we have instincts and drives like all other creatures do. And Jaak Panksepp was the expert in terms of understanding those mechanisms in mammal brains, which include us. We are mammals. And so he had an enormous influence on me. In fact, you mentioned, before we started this interview, you mentioned to me that you've just bought my latest book with the title The Hidden Spring. Yeah. And the book is dedicated to the memory of Jaak Panksepp.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that we are now much more vaccinated with your contribution, and I'm sure that our listeners have learned a lot from your presentations. Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure, and I hope to have more opportunities to contact you. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.